So we're in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. That comes from the Greek word apocalypsis.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Revelation. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 12.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
Okay, so last week, we had this intermission between the blowing of the sixth trumpet and the seventh trumpet, where the Bible started describing some of the players in this last day scenario. And we learned about this huge angel that resembled Jesus Christ. And then we were told about these two witnesses and their ministries to the Jews that they held in front of the Antichrist rebuilt temple. So now in chapter 11, verse 15, we hear that the seventh trumpet has been blown. And before we see this pouring out of the seven bowl judgments, we're introduced to all these different characters, all these players behind the scenes. And so we're going to learn what's been going on in the spiritual realm ever since the Garden of Eden and before the creation. Because in this history of the earth, there is this reality, a reality that we don't see. And we wouldn't know anything about it unless we were told about it. And so if you remember, there was a silence at the beginning of the opening of the seven seals. But now in heaven, it's loud again. And it says there are loud voices in heaven. And what they're saying is that the world is the Lord's again. And from now on, it'll always be Christ's reign forever and ever. And I have these 24 elders again, and they're all worshiping, but now they're on their faces, and they're all giving thanks. And when I read their praise here, what I notice is that God here, he's ready to reward his people. And it says it's all his prophets and all his saints. And the way it reads, it sounds like the people on earth, that they were already angry with God before his wrath was ever poured out on the earth in any type of judgment. That they were already discontent with God and they were mad because they wanted to have the world their way. So they rebelled and they wouldn't walk with him and they wouldn't go along with God's plan. But God, he wanted them to. So this is not because God didn't love them, because he did and he does. But it's time now for God to correct them. And so all of this wrath is a correction to their rebellion. And here it tells us that these rebels, that they were destroying God's earth. And that's exactly what it says here that God is doing. Is he's saying that he should destroy those who destroy the earth. And sometimes I think that we can find ourselves discontent with God's plans for our lives. And we can be angry at God because he didn't allow us to have things our way. And it's not because we ever meant it to be that way. We just became discontent where things didn't turn out the way that we wanted them to. And so we find ourselves where we don't walk with him or in his plans. And we try to make just our own plans where we try to get him to bless our own ways, our own plans, what we think would be good for our lives. But as believers, I don't think God pours out his wrath on us like he's doing here on the world, but that he will always try to correct us because God, he always wants our best. But if we are determined to have our own way and we ignore his plan, he'll let us have our way until we get our fill, until we don't want our way anymore. But here, with these people, they don't turn. And I think it sounds a lot like what Joe was actually talking about this morning, about plans and making plans. But I do know that God, he has great plans for each of us if we're willing to walk with him. And I don't think any of us, we really want to be accused of destroying the things that God is doing, like how these guys here are being accused of actually destroying the earth. But God, he wasn't going to let this go on forever because it wouldn't be right for God to let this go on because of his obedient children. And so now here we see that the temple, now that it's open in heaven. And so this temple is like the temple that was on the earth in Jerusalem that was destroyed in 856 BC by Nebuchadnezzar when Israel was exiled to Babylon. But this temple here, this is the real one. The one that was on earth was just a copy. And so when I look at this and it says that the Ark of the Covenant was up there, in my mind, I wonder if there was also like a copy of actually God's law inside of that one. But now we're seeing up in heaven that there's a lot of activity going on again, that there's these lightnings and thunders and earthquakes and hail. And these are the same judgments that are being poured out on the earth. And so now we start with chapter 12, and it starts with, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven." And it says, "A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars." And then we're told, "Then being with child, she cried out in labor and her pain to give birth." And in chapter 12, we don't only just see one sign here, but we will see two signs. And in some translations, it'll call them two wonders. And the word here, great sign, is the word megasemion. And so we're being told here really clearly that this is a sign. So being a sign, we don't expect to literally see this pregnant woman appear in the heavens, because this is just a symbol for something else. And it's just like that, the second sign that we're introduced to, which is a fiery red dragon with a bunch of heads, horns, and crowns. We don't expect to see this multi-headed dragon flying around the skies either. But this is the way things look from God's view. So these are signs, and so these are written to communicate to us something that's going on in the spiritual realm. And the thing is, if you don't understand who this woman is, you won't really be able to understand what's going on here. And so the question is, well, who is this woman? Well, if you were raised as a Roman Catholic, you'd say, well, this woman, it's obviously Jesus' mother. This is Mary. And you've seen all the paintings and the statues of like the Lady of Fatima, or the Lady of Guadalupe, or the Lady of the Lakes, where she has the sun shining on her and she has the 12 stars around her head and she's standing on this crescent moon. And in some of those pictures, she'll be holding this little baby Jesus. And no matter how great Mary is and how she should be honored, the woman here, this isn't Mary. And it's just like I don't believe the woman here is also Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science Church, who actually claims to be this woman. But just to let you know that the Christian Science Church, it's not really Christian and it's not really science. But even though this isn't Mary here, everybody will agree that the baby who is born to this woman is Jesus. So everybody agrees that this child is Jesus, because we see here that the child is caught up to heaven and that he will rule all nations. But what happens to this woman after Jesus ascended to heaven, we never seen any of those things happen to Mary, where Mary has been seen fleeing into the wilderness. And even though the Catholics, they claim that this woman is Mary, sometimes they'll also claim that this woman is the church. But it's not just the Catholics who claim that this woman is the church. There's a lot of Protestant reformers who also claim that this woman is the church. But this woman can't be the church. And one reason she can't is that the church never gave birth to Jesus. Jesus, he gave birth to the church. The church was never in existence until after Jesus was born, died, resurrected, and ascended. So this woman here, she can't be the church. And the church, it's always been described in Scripture as being a chaste virgin. The bride of Christ has never been described or depicted as a pregnant woman. And as we've been saying all along since we've been studying Revelation, the church is no longer here on the earth at this time. The church has already been raptured and is already in heaven. But those Protestant reformers and some of those Catholics, the reason that they misinterpret this passage is because they never saw Israel ever becoming a nation again. And so they would take all these passages that talked about Israel and they tried to make them all apply to the church. And so they would claim that the church was the new Israel because they actually believed that God was done with Israel and that he had rejected them. But that's not true. God loves Israel and he will keep every promise he ever made to them, just like he'll keep every promise he ever made to us. And so that's who this woman is. This woman is Israel. She's the one who gives birth to the child. It's the nation of Israel. And that's because Jesus, he came from Israel. And Israel in Scripture has always been described as a woman all the way throughout the Old Testament. And not only as just a woman, but she had been described as God's wife. And God's son was to be born through the nation of Israel, God's wife. And so all this imagery that we see here, we've seen this before. But to see this imagery, we have to go all the way back to the beginning and all the way back to the book of Genesis. Because the best commentary on the Bible is actually the Bible itself. And so now we go back to Genesis chapter 37, and we see Joseph, the son of Jacob. And you have to remember, Jacob is also known as Israel, because if you remember, God changed Jacob's name to Israel. And so now we're going to look at Joseph's second dream. And in verse 9 it says, "And Joseph said, 'Look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me.'" And so Joseph here is saying the 11 stars. And the reason is because Joseph himself, he is the 12th star. Because this image is Israel, with Jacob being the son, and the moon being Joseph's mother, and those 12 stars being the 12 tribes of Israel. And we do know that Israel will flee this persecution of the Antichrist at the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation. And that's right after the Antichrist proclaims to be God, and that's when Israel realizes that they have been deceived. And so it's just like it says in Matthew 24, that they need to flee fast, that they're not even supposed to go down from the roof to go get their coats. Okay, so now we're in verse 3, and it says, "There's another sign that appears in heaven." And this word "another" here is again that word allos. So this is meaning another of the same kind. So this is the same kind of sign as the sign of the woman. But this time it's a great fiery red dragon, where it says, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. So again, this is a sign. This is not literal. So we don't expect to see this red dragon flying around the skies. But this represents this person's character. And we're told later in Revelation chapter 17 that these 7 heads, that they represent 7 mountains. And you'll hear some people teach that this is the 7 hills of Rome. But these mountains, they actually don't fit Rome. But that is a view taught by some. But actually that view is kind of just an anti-Catholic propaganda. And I don't think it should be taught, and that's my opinion. But there are 10 horns, and they were told that they represent 10 kings. And 7 diadems, and a diadem is a type of crown. It's the type of a crown that makes a claim to having royal authority. So here we have this dragon, and he wants to be compared to being a king. And we find a parallel passage to this. We find that in Daniel chapter 7 and 8. And it makes it really clear that what we're picturing here is a revived Roman Empire, where these 7 heads and these 7 horns refer to the original 10 kingdoms of the Roman Empire, where 3 of them were subdued by the little horn in Daniel, who is identified as the world ruler during the Great Tribulation. And so we also know that this little horn is just another name for the Antichrist. So it's believed that he will subdue 3 of these kingdoms. But what there is to notice here is that this dragon, he has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns. And that this dragon here is very similar to the beast that's going to be coming out of the sea in the next chapter, with the only difference being that the beast has 10 crowns instead of 7 crowns. So the beast is going to gain 3 crowns. And now we're given this history of this dragon and his background so that we can understand what his relationship to this woman who is with child is. And we know who this dragon is because we're told really clearly in verse 9, where it says in one verse, it uses all the names of this dragon, and it calls him the great dragon, and then it calls him the serpent of old, and that's referring to the serpent that was found in the Garden of Eden, and then it calls him the devil and Satan. And then it says in verse 4 that the tail of this dragon drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and he threw them to the earth. Now, this isn't talking about regular stars, but what it's talking about here, it's talking about angels. And this is a reference to passages like the passage we find in Isaiah 14:12, where it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, you who have weakened the nations." And then we're in Isaiah in verse 13, where it says, where Lucifer said, "I will exalt my throne above the stars of God." And he's talking about exalting himself above the angels of God. And angels, they're also called stars when you look in Job 38, where it says, "The stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." And even if you look at the name Seraph, which is from seraphim, which is a class of angels, that name actually means the burning ones. Okay, so what it's talking about here, and it's believed that 1/3 of the angels that were under Satan's authority, they fell with Satan during his rebellion of God. And then it says that after this fall, the angels from heaven, that the dragon, he stood before the woman who was ready to give birth and devour her child as soon as it was born. Now that is what we have seen throughout the whole Bible. We've seen this conflict with the serpent and the woman and her child. And we've seen this ever since the Garden of Eden back in Genesis 3:15. And that's where God had said to the serpent, he said, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed." And where this dragon has always been trying to destroy the woman and her seed, which means that he's always been trying to destroy Israel, the nation of Israel. And he's always been trying to destroy the Messiah that was to come from Israel. And so it started way back in Genesis. It started in the very beginning when Cain killed Abel, or when Pharaoh, he killed all the male children, trying to throw them into the Nile River. And Pharaoh himself, he was actually called a dragon, if you read in Ezekiel 29. And then when you get to like 2 Kings 11, you see that the seed of David, that the royal messianic line that came from David, it got cut down to just being one person. All the other descendants of the kingly line of David, where the Messiah was to come, they were all murdered. So this dragon has been trying to destroy the Messiah way before he would ever come. And then when you look even in the New Testament, where Herod, where he had murdered all the babies at the time of Christ, because he was trying to devour the child at the time of his birth. And Satan, he's not only hated the Christ, the seed, but Satan, he has always hated the seed's mother, the nation of Israel. And where you can obviously even see it in the world with the anti-Semitism. So it's not just in the Bible, like in Egypt with Pharaoh, or like with Persia with Haman, or with Rome. You see it all over history. You see it with the Hitlers, and you see it with the Stalins. And the world will see it one more time again in the middle of the 7-year tribulation period that we're reading right here. And just to be clear, anti-Semitism is always satanic in origin. So most of what we've read here, it's already happened. And we're told that this male child, which is Jesus, that he will rule all nations with a rod of iron. All right. When I used to read this, and I wouldn't really want to admit this, but it kind of sounded to me like Jesus would rule the world kind of harshly, that he was going to be kind of a very tough ruler and very strict. And that maybe if you got a little out of line, he'd bop you on that head with that rod of iron. But that rod here, it's speaking about a shepherd's rod. And what it's saying is that Jesus will shepherd the people. And that word used here that says to rule, where it says to rule all nation, that's also the same word that's used for shepherding. So Jesus will shepherd all the nations. And being iron, that means that this rod will never be broken or it will never be taken away. But this rod of iron is also mentioned in Psalm 2, where it mentions that the rod of iron will be shattering the nations and dashing them into pieces like a potter's vessel. So Jesus, he will not only be shepherding his people, but he will destroy the nations and the powers that have been destroying his sheep. Okay, and so now we read where God has prepared a place for Israel, the woman, and that God will feed her for 1,260 days, which again, 1,260 days is about 3.5 years. And so this all correlates with the last 3.5 year period of the 7-year tribulation. And so God feeding Israel in the wilderness, it reminds us of the Exodus where God fed and he sustained Israel for 40 years. So in comparison, 40 years to 3.5 years, 3.5 years is not that much. And you have to remember that in the Exodus, God nourished over 2 million people. So it's not difficult for God to provide for Israel again. And so maybe he'll bring back the manna and maybe he'll bring back the quail or maybe he'll do something new. And many people believe where Israel actually flees to is in the rock city of Petra, which is located in the country of Jordan. You may have seen that city because that's the city that they used in that movie, Indiana Jones, The Temple of Doom. And in Petra, at one time, it's said that it housed over 300,000 people. So nowadays, Petra is open and Jews go to Petra. They say about 1,000 Jews travel to Petra a day. So now we get this glimpse in verse 7 of the spiritual battle that's in the future that will be happening in the heavens. And so this is still the midpoint of the tribulation. Now we've read about these kind of battles before. And these kind of battles, we don't see anything going on from our view, from the earth's view. But these things, they go on in heaven. So they're in a realm or dimension that we can't see. So these are not visible to us. But we've heard about this. We've heard about the archangel Michael, and we've heard and we've read about some of his past battles. And the first place we read about him was like back in Daniel 10, where the angel Gabriel, he's telling the prophet Daniel about this archangel Michael and how Gabriel, how he had been prevented from coming to Daniel until Michael came and fought against the prince of the kingdom of Persia, which gave Gabriel some relief so that he could come to Daniel. And that prince of Persia there, well, that was a fallen spiritual entity that had been over the area of Persia. Just like how this Michael the archangel, he in the same way as the prince of Persia, he's also called a prince of the people of Israel. So there are these spiritual entities, some good angels, some bad angels, that are over regions of land and they do battles.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, you can still make it to church today. And join us at 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,